Our sermon tonight is going to start over in Matthew chapter 5 and verse 16. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven. In this part in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is trying to impress upon us how radically different Christians are from the darkness of the world. The world, the way in which they live, the way in which they dress, the way in which they speak, is radically different from Christians to where we stand out like a light in darkness, a city set on a hill that can't be hid. He also, in the same context here, talks about how we're the salt of the earth. And both of these are trying to impress upon us the influence for good that we should be having on all of those with whom we come in contact with. Please recognize this. Everyone who knows you, who is around you, they're listening to you. They're watching you. Everything that you are saying and doing in their presence is affecting them somehow, some way. And hopefully, if you are living the Christian life, people know this because of the way you speak and the way you dress and the things you do and the things you refuse to do. You are so radically different from everyone else in the world. You stand out and you are the light of the world. What we're going to be doing here in our sermon this evening, we're going to be talking about the influence and the examples that we are meant to be as Christians in our lives. And we're going to be going through three different stages of our lives. We're going to be talking about the days of our youth, and then middle age and adulthood, and finally we're going to conclude with talking about old age. Now, as I go through the sermon, I'm going to let you figure out where you are. I'm not going to tell you you're in old age. But when I start describing the way you are living and feeling and seeing, you'll figure out real quickly where you are. I have something I want to ask all of us to do here this evening. I want you to be thinking to yourself, who are the people in my life who have had the most influence for good in my life? When you look at yourself and you see how you have possibly attained to where you are today, ask yourself, okay, who are the people that have helped me become who I am? Who are the people who have influenced me to where I am today? Your top 10 people. Okay? Now let's start with the time of youth. I was born in Grenada, Mississippi. And the people I went to school with in the first grade, I graduated with. And so we grew up together. And I remember the age of transition when the hormones started kicking in. I remember when I woke up and all of a sudden I was taller and I sounded like Darth Vader. During that time, my friends that were already dear friends of mine that I grew up with, they started changing. They started going in different directions. I remember when I was 12 years old, one of the hardest things happened to me in that time in my life. One of my good friends I found out was a homosexual. And I remember even when I was 12 years old, I remember talking to my mom and dad about it. And I remember as a young child, even at that age, I realized I can't hang with him anymore. Because I understood even then, if I'm going to hang with him, if I'm going to go over to his house, I'm going to have to go that way. And I'm not going to be that. I never went back to his house again. He was my friend. When I was 13, that was when my friends started smoking pot and started having sex and started drinking. The transition age is difficult because people you know and you're already friends with are going to start going in different directions. 1 Timothy chapter 4, verse 12. Let no one despise your youth, but be an example to the believers in word, in conduct, in love, in spirit, in faith, in purity. This text here is speaking to Timothy. We don't know how old he was, but the text talks about him in the days of his youth. And he tells us here what the Lord expected of Timothy. He expected Timothy to be an example to the believers. Those of you that are young, listen to me right now. What God expects of you right now, in your youth, He expects you to be the light of the world now. He expects you to be the salt of the earth now. This isn't something you become later on. This is what He expects of you today. Whenever I made my list, there were two people that I put on my list of top 10 people who influenced me. One was Eddie Bagwell Jr. He was the preacher's son. And when you're 14 and your buddies are getting high and your friends are having sex and your friends are getting drunk, it is really wonderful that there's somebody who's trying to live the Christian life. And it was Eddie Bagwell Jr. And then there was another girl that worshiped with us, Debbie Smith. There were just two. I lived in Mississippi, folks. We were isolated. We were isolated away from basically all folks around us. And so the only two folks around me that were close to my age that were trying to live it were Eddie and Debbie. That's what I'm trying to tell you. Right now, in the days of your youth, be an example, because there are people your age who are already trying to live it, and their friends around them are going bonkers. Their friends around them are going into alcohol and drugs and sex and homosexuality and all kinds of directions. You know that's the case. But when you choose to be a Christian in the days of your youth, while so many others around you are going into the world, you are so radically different from them. Because you won't go along with them. You won't have sex. You won't get drunk. You won't get high. You're going to be like light in darkness. Yes, there may be few, but you be part of that few. Because those who are part of the few need one another desperately at this time of transition in your life. Look at this text over here in Psalm 25:7. Do not remember the sins of my youth, nor my transgressions. According to your mercy, remember me for your goodness' sake, O Lord. Notice this phrase here, the sins of my youth. I understand that. I told you there was a time when all of my friends were going in crazy directions. I did all right as long as I had Eddie there and Debbie were there. But then I went to college. And Eddie had moved. And Debbie didn't go to college with me. And I was a stranger in a far country. That was the time I left God, was when I went to college. As I've told y'all before, it is something I'm terribly ashamed of. But from that experience, I've learned that it's difficult sometimes to come home. 1 Corinthians 15:33, do not be deceived. Evil company corrupts good habits. You see, I was deceived for a while. I thought I could hang around these people in college and I wouldn't become like them. But that doesn't work that way, folks. If you're going to hang around people that drink, guess what? You can get pulled into it. If you're going to hang around folks that get high and get stoned and get drunk, birds of a feather flock together, and sooner or later you're going to become like them. And what's going to happen is, over a period of time, you're going to have more and more friends that are drinking and getting high and getting stoned together. And so all of your friends do this. If you are someone who has left God, you are probably friends with a lot of people that are in the world in darkness and in sin. And one of the hardest things to do is to come to the realization that you can't stay friends with them. Do not be deceived. Evil company corrupts good habits. And one of the hardest things I ever did in my life was walk away from my friends. Because we were tight. But I understood, if I hang with you, I'm going to hell. Proverbs says in 12:26, the righteous should choose his friends carefully, for the way of the wicked leads them astray. You see that last part again? The way of the wicked will lead you astray. If you make friends with wicked people, they're going to lead you astray. Don't be deceived thinking you're different. You won't get pulled into it. You are going to get pulled into it if your friends are worldly. But look at the first part of this. The righteous should choose his friends carefully. One of the biggest events in my life was when I decided to go to Florida College. I remember crossing the Florida state line. And I remember what I said to myself. It's either heaven or hell. It's either now or never. I was struggling spiritually. I was going to church, even speaking publicly, but I knew I was going to hell. The first person I met at Florida College when I was going into admissions was Larry McClinney. The second person standing next to him was his first cousin, James McClinney. And then standing next to James was Jeff Young. I can't help but believe that it was providence that I met those three men. Because I remember the very first night sitting in the dorm room and I was talking with them. Now, you've got to understand something about me. I was raised in the church. My father was an elder. And if you are a prodigal son and your father's an elder and you get caught, yeah, then your father is no longer qualified, is he? So, I became a professional hider. Nobody knew me. Nobody. I let nobody in. You remember my sermon last night about the solitary soldier? That, ladies and gentlemen, was me. I was alone, I was lost, and I let nobody in. The very first night talking to Larry and James and Jeff, I was sitting in there, and I remember standing up on my bed. I was sitting down on the bed, and I stood up and I said, "You're like me. You think like I think. You understand like I understand." And I did something I had never done. I let down my barrier and I let someone in. I told them what I had been struggling with for years. And you know what they did? They said, "Yeah, we have been too." You remember me telling you last night how Satan's going to whisper in your ear, you can't let people in because what are they going to think about you? What are they going to say about you? You know what they said? They all said, "Yeah, we understand. We're struggling with the same sins too." I wasn't alone. I wasn't alone. And so I started opening up, and they opened up. And we started praying for one another, and we started encouraging one another, and we would call each other up even when we went home. And when I came back to Mississippi, the people that knew me, they all said, "You're not the same person. You've changed." Yes, I had changed. I'm here to tell you, you're not meant to be solitary soldiers fighting your spiritual battles by yourself. You need someone in the trenches beside you, someone who can exhort you daily, someone you can confess to and pray for one another daily. That changed my life, and I refuse to ever hide again. What you're seeing in the pulpit, folks, this is me. It's all me. I don't try to hide anything anymore. So if you're a hider, if you're a solitary soldier, you need to choose some Christian friends. I told you earlier I had to say bye to a lot of friends. I could tell you stories about that, and it wasn't easy, folks. I mean, they didn't like it. They loved me. But I would go to hell if I would have stayed friends with them. There was a time in my life where I didn't have many friends back in Mississippi. I went home to my home state. I did my first work there. There was a reason. I had to clean up what I messed up. Before I could do God's work in the kingdom, I had to go home and clean up what I'd messed up in my home state. I am who I am today on my top 10 list because of Larry McKinney, James McClenny, and Jeff Young. Those three men helped me become the Christian man I am today. And I have learned since then, I let go of a lot of friends in the world, and there was a time when I felt lonely because I felt like there weren't many folks out there, but guess what, folks? That ain't the case today. I'm leaving this building tonight with more friends than I've ever had back then. God's people are the best people on earth. I'm telling you that. I get to meet them. I get to travel around this country and meet them. They're awesome. Everywhere. Get them and make friends with them. Now then, the next stage of your life. Adulthood. There was a time in my life when these are the words that I said, "Who is that?" And the answer was, "That's Missy Daniel." And I wanted to get to know Linda Daniel better. And I talked with her. I was amazed by how beautiful her heart was and how sincere her faith was. And falling in love with her was the easiest thing I ever did. And so after we went on our first date, 4 weeks later, I asked her to marry me. And then 4 weeks later after that, I married her. Yeah, it was quick. I knew it was in front of me, and I knew it was right, and I wasn't going to let it go. I entered adulthood then. And then after a period of time, we went to see the doctor, and he says, "Yeah, there's a baby there." It's the only time in my life I jumped in the air and clicked my heels. I would kill myself if I tried to do that now. It was just a natural reaction. And I remember all of a sudden realizing I'm a parent. I got responsibilities now. I got to provide for this child. I got to raise this child. I got to teach this child. Adulthood. Proverbs 17:6 says, "Children's children are the crown of old men, and the glory of children is their father." Fathers are the glory of children. We look up to Dad. My dad was my hero. And so whenever I was making my list of my top 10 people who influenced me, I put down Dad. And I erased it. And I put down Mom. And then I erased it. And I put down Dad. And then finally, I just gave in and said Dad/Mom. I am who I am today because I'm Wayne Fancher Jr. I am who I am today because I was blessed to be the son of Wayne Fancher Sr. and Mary Frances Fancher, a God-fearing man and woman who raised me. I told you earlier, my father was an elder, and yet I was a prodigal son. I want you to learn something, folks. If you have a son or a daughter who has gone astray, and if you love them and taught them, it's not your fault. But learn this and know this. If you've taught them and you've loved them, if they go astray, they have something to come back to because they know the truth and they've seen the truth. Parents, we must be the light of the world and the salt of the earth to our children. They are watching us and listening to us. Children have big ears and big eyes. They're listening and they're watching. And so we need to realize the awesome impact we as their parents are having upon their life. We want our example before them to be an example of Christianity where if they do go astray, they'll have something to come back to. But hopefully they won't ever go astray. Hopefully they were so influenced by your example, they will stay faithful. So that being said, do we have any perfect parents here? No, we don't. You're going to mess up sometimes, okay? And sometimes you're going to blow it spiritually in front of your own children. What do you do about those moments when you sin in front of your own flesh and blood children? Listen real close now. You don't sweep it under the rug like nothing happened. You need to realize your children are watching. And that's when you bring them in and you set them down and you say in front of them, I'm sorry for what I said. I'm sorry for what I did. I've asked God's forgiveness and now I'm asking yours. They may not fully understand what's going on, but I assure you they'll remember it, won't they? Yeah, you see her shaking her head, what that means is, yeah, I did that. I messed up. I'm going to give you an old Mississippi saying, if you mess up, fess up. Be willing to tell folks, I'm sorry for what I did and it was wrong. Because you don't want yourself and your actions to be a stumbling block to your own children spiritually. Joel 1:3, tell your children about it. Let your children tell their children and their children another generation. I don't want to be the weak link in the chain. I don't want to be the one who becomes a stumbling block to my children, and then my children are a bigger stumbling block to my grandchildren. And so the best thing I can do as a parent is to be the light of the world to my children, to really live Christianity at home, to be for real. My mom and dad were real. They were the real McCoy. And so I knew the truth, and I had something to come back to. 1 Corinthians 7:6. For how do you know, O wife, whether you will save your husband? And how do you know, O husband, whether you will save your wife? The text here is talking about the influence a Christian husband or wife can have on their spouse. It's all in who you marry. Be wise in choosing your friends. Be even wiser in choosing your spouse. Because your spouse is going to influence you and your family more than anyone. If you are married to an unbeliever, I want to encourage you right now to do the best you can to live the Christian life with your spouse. Realizing he or she, if they're not a Christian, they're watching, they're listening. And you can draw them to God by being the light of the world with your husband or your wife. It's over here, 1 Peter 1, chapter 3, verses 1 through 2. Wives, likewise, be submissive to your own husbands, that even if some do not obey the word, they without a word may be won by the conduct of their wives, when they observe your chaste conduct accompanied by fear. Here is a woman who's married to an unbeliever. But her unbelieving husband, he is observing her chaste conduct. He's observing her respect, her fear. And he realizes she is this way because of her religion. And so when he looks behind her actions, he finds her faith, and he finds himself being drawn to God by Christ shining through her. The power of an example. The influence of the Christian example. I want to share with you two stories. These two stories are for anybody here or in this congregation that's married to an unbeliever. The first story takes me back to Grenada. One of the brethren there was Dr. Hyde, prince of a man, very faithful Christian. Every time the doors were open, he was there. But his wife was another story. I never heard her mentioned until one day at the dinner table when I was younger, and my mother and father were talking at the dinner table about Dr. Hyde's wife. And all I heard was, yes, she hates the church. She locks the children in their bedrooms on Sundays so he can't take them to church. I remember that when I was young. When I went to services with my parents, I always sat between them. And one time, my mom leaned over me talking to my dad, and she said, "Brad, look who's here." And so I had to turn around and look. Who's here? And there was Brother Hyde coming in, and there was this woman with him. There was a woman with Brother Hyde. Who's that woman? Well, that's his wife. And you know, she kept coming. And she kept coming. And she kept coming. I was going to college at the time. And I came home on the weekend. And that weekend, Mrs. Hyde went forward to obey the gospel. And the reason that time stands out in my mind is the only time I've ever remembered when almost everybody in the church, men and women, were all crying tears of joy. Because they all knew how many decades he had been trying to get his wife to come to the Lord. And Sister Hyde died in Christ. The next story comes from Searcy, Arkansas. I have permission, by the way, to tell these stories. Sister Ward was married to a man who was not a member of the church. I was invited to come over to the house one day and eat, and as he and I were in the living room alone, I'm going to go after you. If I'm alone with you and you're not a Christian, I'm coming after you, okay? And so I immediately start trying to convert Mr. Ward. And he looked at me and he said, "You don't understand, Wayne. I hate the Church of Christ." Oh, I hadn't heard that one before. And he said, and he told me the reason why I hated it, okay? But he kept coming with her. He was more faithful in attendance than some of our members. He would always come with her to worship services. Well, he had emphysema. And one time he went into the hospital with emphysema, and I knew he wasn't coming out. And so I went to him in the hospital and I said, "Mr. Ward, I'm sorry for all the things that happened in the past. I'm sorry for what they said and did to you. I'm sorry. But I know that you believe Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. I know you believe it. And it's time for you to put aside all your bitterness, and it's time for you to obey the gospel, because you and I both know you're not coming out of this hospital. You're going to be meeting God pretty soon." He looked at me and he said, "You're right, Wayne." We put him in a wheelchair, carried him down to physical therapy, had a great big baptism. It wasn't baptism, tub. We used chains, actually, to pick him up, put him down in there. We baptized him in physical therapy. You know what Brother Ward did his last 7 days of life before he died? He had his family come into his room, and one by one he preached Christ crucified to them. telling everybody in his family that they needed to obey the gospel and not follow his example. And at the end of the week, Brother Ward died in Christ. I want to tell you those two stories because if you're married to an unbeliever, it can become very discouraging if you've been working on them for decades. And you may be thinking, I'm not getting through. I'm not getting through. They're not going to obey the gospel, and you love them. They are your husband. They are your wife. And yet you know they're lost. Never give up. Never give up on your spouse. Be the light of the world and the salt of the earth and continue to live the Christian example before your husband or your wife. You don't know whether or not you're going to save them by your example. Titus 2, 7 through 8. In all things showing yourself to be a pattern of good works and doctrine showing integrity, reverence, incorruptibility, sound speech that cannot be condemned, that one who is an opponent may be ashamed, having nothing evil to say of you. Look at the last part of this in verse 8. One who is an opponent. There are people out in the world who are not Christians, and they're watching you. A lot of time it's the people you work with, okay? Or the people you go to school with. They're watching you, especially if they know you call yourself a Christian. I want to share another story with you. This one comes from Lindale, Texas. I had a woman one time call me and ask me if she could have a Bible study with me. Wow, wait, that's really good. We go after them. She called me. She said, you're the preacher at the Lindale Church of Christ? I said, yes. She said, can I have a Bible study with you? I said, sure. And so the very first time I was having a Bible study with this lady, I said, I got to know, why did you call me? And this is what she told me. I was working at the elementary school, and I decided it was time for me to try to get religion in my life, and so I started watching all the people that I worked with. And I observed the way they talked. I observed the way they carried themselves and the things that they did. And I noticed that the nurse, she didn't talk like everybody else. And she was very kind. And she was very loving. And so I went up to her and I said, where do you worship? And she said, the Lindale Church of Christ. She said, okay, all right. And then she continued going on watching the people that she worked with, and then she observed a substitute teacher. And she observed the way she lived and the way she conducted herself with the other people. And she figured out, you're different than everybody else here. And so she went to her and said, where do you worship? And the answer was, the Lindale Church of Christ. And she said, all right then. And she called the preacher at the Lindale Church of Christ. And she said, I want to study with you. And yes, she is our sister in Christ today. You see, folks, they are watching you. And sometimes they're waiting for you to mess up. Just so they can say, see, you're just like everybody else. I don't need to be a Christian. So that being said, what do you do if you mess up at work in front of the people you work with? You remember your children earlier? If you mess up, fess up. Yeah. They may not understand it. But if you sin in front of the people you're working with, I encourage you to call them in and say, I'm sorry for what I did. It's not Christianity. You don't want to ever be a stumbling block to anyone. And you need to realize this. They are listening and they are watching. So be the light of the world. Romans 14:13. Therefore, let us not judge one another anymore, but rather resolve this, not to put a stumbling block or a cause to fall in a brother's way. Now we're dealing with our relationship with one another. In this congregation, you are watching each other. And over a period of time, you develop respect for one another. And there are men and women that you find yourself looking up to with great respect. When I was going to Florida College, they were going through the process of appointing elders back in Grenada, my home congregation. And so from Florida College, I sent the name of one of my teachers when I was a young man growing up in that congregation. I sent my ideas of who I thought was qualified to be an elder home. When I came back home after Christmas break, I asked my dad, so how are things going? And I brought up the name of the man whose name I had put forward, and I said, what about him? And he said, oh, we withdrew from him. What? You withdrew from him? I put his name up to be an elder? Yeah, he had this thing with alcohol. He liked getting drunk. And years later, I was at a restaurant, and he came in. He was drunk. And when he went out of the restaurant, I went out of the restaurant, and I went to him in the parking lot. And I told him how much I looked up to him. You were my teacher in my youth. And here you are, a public drunk. And he just looked at me and he said, people change. And walked away. You're being watched in this congregation. And if you have a name that people look up to with honor and respect, you need to understand how destructive your going into sin can be. Ecclesiastes 10 and verse 1 says, dead flies putrefy the perfumer's ointment and cause it to give off a foul odor. So does a little folly to one respected for wisdom and honor. If you are a man or a woman who is looked up to and respected for wisdom and honor, and then you foolishly choose to go into sin, your actions can be massively destructive as a stumbling block to people in that congregation. So again, if you mess up and you sin in public, even if you're an elder or a preacher, what do? You go before the congregation, you confess the sin to them and to God, and you beg for forgiveness from them and God. You never just think sin is okay and it can be left out there. It must be dealt with. We must understand the impact of our influence and our example to the people around us. Now, old age. I'll explain old age to you by what my dad told me. The body and the mind. The mind says go, and the body says no. And every month, you go into another funeral of a dear friend. And your emotions become more difficult to control. Dick, we used to have a nickname for my dad. You knew my dad. My father was a tough man. He was an elder. He was a tough man, thick skin. And the children, we called him the grizzly bear. He was tough in his emotions. But once he got older, he became the teddy bear. I remember driving away, looking in the rearview mirror to see my father crying behind me. Ecclesiastes calls them the difficult days, when a grasshopper is a burden, the days of darkness. Okay. What does God expect of us in the difficult days? What does God expect of us in the days of darkness as we're getting older? He expects us to be the light of the world. He expects us to be the salt of the earth all the way to the close of our life. 2 Corinthians 4:16, therefore we do not lose heart, even though the outward man is perishing, yet the inward man is being renewed day by day. Okay? The outward man is perishing. The outward man is getting weaker physically. But even though you may be getting weaker physically, as a Christian, you should have been growing in the Christian attributes now for decades, hopefully. And at this time in your life, your light should be shining brighter than it ever has, to where people can look at you and they can see Christ shining through you. Titus says in chapter 2 now, verses 2 through 3, that the older men be sober, reverent, temperate, sound in faith, in love, and patience. The older women likewise, that they be reverent in behavior, not slanderers, not given to much wine, teachers of good things. You see, the text here is dealing with the example of older men and women. Proverbs 16:31. The silver-haired head is a crown of glory, if it is found in the way of righteousness. I have a question I want to ask all of you tonight, okay? What is the most beautiful thing in the world? That's the question. What is the most beautiful thing in this world? Okay. I believe there are many beautiful things that God created in our world. But I believe the pinnacle of beauty is women. Every woman. You are the pinnacle of beauty in the creation. But among women, there are some women that are physically beautiful, but as we used to say in Mississippi, they got snakes in their head. They're ugly inside. The most beautiful women are the women who are beautiful inside too. My wife is physically beautiful, yeah, that drew me to her. But I didn't fall in love with her physical beauty. I fell in love with her heart. I fell in love with what was really beautiful. And what was really beautiful, guess what? It just keeps getting more beautiful. And even though the outward man may be perishing, the inward man, it just gets better and better every day. The most beautiful thing on this planet is the older Christian woman. You are the most beautiful thing on this planet. You are the pinnacle of God's creation and beauty. And then you have inward beauty as a God-fearing woman. And then you have been growing for decades in the Christian attributes. And so your light is shining brighter now than it ever has. Please know this about yourself. The silver-haired head is a crown of glory. Crown of glory. I see some crowns of glories around here. I kind of got an idea some of those crowns of glory are covered up in dye. But that's okay. That's okay. It's still your crown of glory because it's been found in the way of righteousness. You are righteous women. You are the most beautiful thing there is on God's creation. Let your light shine. Let it shine all the way to the end of your life. Psalm 71:18. Now also when I am old and gray-headed, O God, do not forsake me until I declare your strength to this generation, your power to everyone who is to come. All right, all of you men and women who are older Christians, what does God expect of us at this stage in our life? Yeah, I'm in that stage. What does he expect of us at this stage in our life? He expects us to be the light of the world. to truly be the salt of the earth, to be an example to everyone around us of what Christianity really is. Because here he's talking about declaring the strength of God to this generation. There's a generation that's coming behind us. One generation dies, another is born, the earth abides forever. We're finishing our race, okay? If life is but a vapor, we're on fumes, aren't we? We ain't got much left to live. So what we're going to do with what we got left to live, we're going to be the light of the world, and we're going to be the salt of the earth, and we're going to try to do the best we can to teach the generations coming behind us, to pass the truth to the generations coming behind us. Dick, I feel good about the next generations coming behind us. When I see men like Travis, Trey, Kyle, I gladly, with honor, pass the torch to the next generation. And then there's going to be a time when you're going to be the old men. All of us that are older, okay, declare the strength of our God to this generation so they in turn can declare it to the next generation, and then they to the next generation, and then they to the next generation till the Lord comes again. The last part of the verse, your power to everyone who is to come. You know, one of the things that was the most beautiful things to see this week, I don't want to embarrass you, but people walking in the building with your cane, yeah. People coming in the building with your walkers. People coming in the building in your wheelchairs. It's beautiful. Beautiful. You're teaching a lesson. You're teaching a lesson to those of us that are younger, whose bodies are still working, who still have strength. We know it's difficult for you to get here. We know you're probably in pain while you are here. And yet, you're here. You're coming together to worship God together with God's people. You're coming together to feed on the Word of God. You are setting the example to everyone who's younger than you. You're declaring, getting back to the text here, you're declaring His strength to this generation. You're declaring His power to everyone who is to come. And so we see your example in your faith, and we're going to do the best we can to follow that example. To where we're going to run our race all the way to the very end, being the light of the world and the salt of the earth, all the way to the very end of our life. Okay. Who's your top 10? Coming back to the introduction. Who's your top 10? Mom and Dad. My wife. 3 friends that I met at Florida College. James, Jeff, Larry. 2 friends when I was 13 and 14. Eddie Bragwell Jr. and Debbie Smith. The rest are preachers. Eddie Bragwell Sr., who baptized me. Melvin Curry at Florida College. D. Bowman. Yeah, he does. Not long ago. That's why I am before you tonight, who I am. These people were in my life. And every one of them influenced me for good so that I could be a Christian man, so that I could hopefully finish my own race in Christ one day and finally be with our God and our Lord Jesus Christ and all the saved in heaven. So who are your top 10? Now I got one more important question. Are you on anybody's top 10 list of influences for good in their life? If you answer that, no, probably not. Really? Why? Are you fake? Are you a hypocrite? Are you actually in darkness? If you are the light of the world, If you are the salt of the earth, you're going to be a blessing for whoever you come in contact with. When I sat down and I made this list up, I assure you, Debbie Smith did not realize the impact she had on me. I actually called her one time and told her, you need to know this about how important you were to me at that stage in my life. Because at that stage in my life, everybody went crazy. But you. And because you and Eddie were there, I could stay faithful during that time. Young people, those of you that are choosing to be Christians in your youth, you're awesome. You're awesome. The world's gotten darker in our lifetime, hasn't it? And the pressure on these young people is intense. Those of you that are young, be the light of the world and take the slings and the arrows and the pressure that comes with it. But seek out friends that are of like faith. Find people that are of like faith. Christians make great friends. Befriend Christians and then strengthen and encourage one another as you're going through all the garbage you're facing in the world around you. When you reach the age of adulthood, be the light of the world. Be the salt of the earth with your children, with your husband, with your wife, with the people you work with the people you worship with. And if there's times when you mess up, and you will, have the humility to be willing to apologize and ask forgiveness. The people at work may not understand it. The children may not understand it. But you will, because you're understanding the impact of your example before them. And the last thing you want to be is a stumbling block to anyone on this planet. Our job is, first of all, to make ourselves right with God and to try to help as many as we can make it to heaven. And those of us that are in our older age, be the light of the world. Let your light shine. Be the salt of the earth. Hold on to your faith. Live by faith all the way to the very close of your life and die in the Lord. And when the resurrection does come, and it's coming, we will all be back together again. That's why I said in the very beginning, I may not see you again on this side. If I don't, I'll see you on the other. Okay? All right? I hope we'll cross paths again. I wasn't joking when I said, I love you already. I hope to see all of you again one day. But you know where I really want to see you? I want to see you in heaven, okay? All right? Okay? Okay? I want to see you in heaven. Hold on to your faith and live by faith and be the light of the world all the way to the close. And one day, we're going to be before God together. We're going to be before the throne of Jesus together. And we'll worship our God in heaven together.